Hi, I'm Erin. I'm the Information Management Coordinator for the Pacific region of the Canadian Wildlife Service. I'm calling in today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, where I am privileged to live and work. And I'm excited about this particular session because I spend a lot of time talking to people about kind of what those first steps of RIM are and why we're taking particular steps. And so I'm really excited to do it with a different group of people today.
Great, thanks, Erin. I'll just give a quick introduction to myself before we get started as well. So I'm Michelle Baroka. I'm a records and information management consultant and professionally trained archivist. I'm located in the traditional and unceded territory of the Chinooka Nation, which is in the southeast area of British Columbia. I've been in this field for over 20 years. I've worked in and for First Nations and local government, so that's primarily my area of expertise. So unlike federal government, it's more local and directly related to First Nations. So I do primarily work within BC, and I also work with some organizations in Yukon. So I'm really happy to be here co-presenting with Erin today and sharing a very condensed and hopefully very helpful and straightforward introduction to RIM, Records and Information Management. Okay. So Erin, is it okay if I just kind of start us off with a few key concepts and kind of bigger picture?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Has anyone here already taken any RIM training? A little bit, yes? If you haven't, that's perfectly okay. That's why we're here, right? We're here to learn. So one of the things that I'm very fortunate to be able to do is facilitate various RIM training sessions on behalf of the Fmpss. So you may have heard me at the beginning there mention there's MTAs. That is what that is management training academies that the Fmpss provides. So we had a session early this year. I'm sure there'll be another one offered in the near future, specifically around records and information management. There's other MTAs that focus on HR and policy development as well. So with the information that we'll be providing you today, it's going to be something of a condensed version of those sessions, but we certainly welcome your questions, comments as we spend the next 45 minutes together. Okay. So just to start us out then with some bigger picture concepts about RIM. I think we can all appreciate and agree that information is a very powerful asset. So our records, they are an asset of our organizations, but as we've been hearing throughout the morning, we have challenges in terms of how do we elevate that importance so that it's viewed as an asset that you would then strategically plan towards, just like you do with finances, infrastructure, and your people. So knowing that information is a very powerful asset, when we mismanage our information, that becomes a liability to our organizations. Okay, so in a lot of ways, risk management is records management. That's a big part of what it is we're doing. It's also important to note that when we're talking about records and information management, we're not limiting the conversation to paper. We're talking about various electronic formats of records. It's not just PDFs. We have various email, we have sound recordings, videos, photographs, you name it, right? Text messages, instant messaging chats. There's all kinds of ways that we're creating information. And we need to be able to manage it. Right? With records and information management, it is something that involves everyone, right? That's also a theme that we're hearing today. And a big reason of that is we're all creating information. We're all receiving it. We're all using it to perform our job duties. So we all have a little bit of a records management role to the work that we're performing. With records programs and with records management in general, it's also important to keep in mind that these are continually works in progress. Okay, they're ongoing. So if you're in a position where you are embarking on a project to get started, and maybe we need some policy development work, we need to make sure we have a classification system and a retention schedule, some of those foundational materials, which we're going to touch more on here. Okay. A big question is, okay, where do we start? Right? Do I need to reinvent the wheel? Is there somewhere else that we can point to? So I'm going to share another link with you here in the chat, just as a way, if you're interested in perusing the site as we're chatting. So this is the link to the Fmpss website where it speaks specifically about records and information management. So in here, there is a model classification and retention schedule. There's procedures and a lot of really great information there, as well as a outdated legal citation index. So I'm just going to note that that information, though, that entire toolkit is being revamped as we speak, and it should be available shortly. And that content will be uploaded then back onto the Fmpss site. Final key concept I really wanted to share with you is that like applications, software, they're tools, right? They're not solutions. So we've been hearing that theme again today. Okay, so if you're thinking about, oh, this is all great, but I just need to know what kind of software we need to utilize, there's more to the conversation before we can get there. Right, Erin? Yes. So in a very, very simple, basic sense, records and information management is really knowing what you have, where you have it, and how long you need to keep it, right? So if you don't have a good sense of where your records are, so whether they're in the cloud, whether they're on servers, in email, in paper, microform, what have you, if you don't know where are our records, what do we actually have? Well, we're kind of not managing our records, are we? That's such a key component of records management. So if we're not doing that, that's really the starting place, right? Is understanding just what do we have? Because all of the work we do, whether we're using databases specifically, or we're in a hybrid environment with paper and electronic, which I presume most of us are, right? There's no one quick fix. There's no one solution. Okay, so we have to abide by principles in terms of, you know, the records life cycle, which I believe Erin's going to talk to us a little bit more about. How do we manage the records throughout that life cycle? What does that even mean to us? Why do we bother? Why is RIM important anyway? Right? So by knowing what we have, we can then determine how long we need to be keeping those records. And then whether or not we're going to send those records off to an archives or a storage area, or they're going to be ultimately destroyed, right? Those are really our options. So like I mentioned with RIM, it's really a risk management tool, okay? So with records management in general, it's really a combination of sorts, right? There's not necessarily one thing that we can point to say, this is records management. If you have a records manual, absolutely, you're going to point to that and say, this is what's helping us guide our journey, okay? Quite often we're lacking those kinds of tools in our organizations. A lot of times that information is in a person's mind, right? It's in their head, it's knowledge that they hold. And when they leave our organizations, that knowledge leaves with them. Makes it very difficult for those people who are coming in after you to try to determine what to do with perhaps those boxes of records that they've inherited from your office that they're now occupying, right? So when you're not familiar with the operations of the organization, it makes it extremely difficult to make decisions about retention. Right, Erin?
Oh, yes.
Have you been in that position where you've inherited files from others?
Yeah, I'm actually, one of my colleagues right now is getting ready to retire, and I'm very excited because he reached out to me, he's retiring in a couple months. He was like, I have 20 boxes in my office, and as scary as any email that starts with "I have 20 boxes in my office" is, it's so much better to get that email, in late June when they're retiring in the fall than, 2 weeks beforehand. So
That's right.
yeah, knowing what you have, where you have it, and being able to pull it forward when you need it, that's kind of, I would say, the crux of it. Because
Yes,
if you know you have something, but you can't find it, and you can't bring it forward when you need it, you don't actually have it in any actionable way.
that's right. That's right. So it makes it very difficult because really we're all just trying to find the information we need at the time we need it, right?
Exactly.
When we find it later, it's too late. We actually need it when we need it, right?
Yeah.
So it's really important that we have those kinds of systems in place where we have the ability to say, look up information in a simple Excel spreadsheet, for example, right? To
Oh,
say,
I love my Excel
where
spreadsheets.
are, oh, exactly, me too. So to identify whether it's per department or in per building, that's really for you to determine as you're working your way through. Definitely starting small, starting in areas where you're going to have the most impact for success. That would be my suggestion for starting. So whether it's, we need to make sure that we're not missing any of our chief and council meeting packages over the last few years, right? Where do you start? Well, where do we keep those records? Do we have a listing of them already? Is there a calendar that we can cross-reference to say, we know that these are when those dates occurred, so we should have a file that's correlating with those dates, right? So being able to utilize those kinds of tools. And I do have a simple Excel spreadsheet template that I can share with you if you're interested. That might help you get started. Wendy, yes? Okay, fabulous. So I will do that. If you like, we can also do a little bit of screen sharing here. So we're really hoping that this is a bit more informal. So please feel free to reach out with questions and your comments as we're working along, okay?
Jump in whenever.
Yes, please do. So just for fun, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pop in the file inventory. It did it to me again. Oh, no, it didn't. We're good. Okay, so you should have all received it now.
Can I interrupt you just for a second?
Yes.
I'm just taking notes as I'm writing or as you're talking. So I'm not ignoring you. I'm not distracted. I'm just taking notes as you're talking.
That's fine. Please feel free. Absolutely. Okay, so the Excel spreadsheet that I've just shared in the chat, I'll share that with Amory. He'll get that out to everyone as well. So that was a spreadsheet that we've utilized within one of the RIM MTAs previously, just as a tool to help you out. So if you're wondering where to even begin, this might be a really helpful place for you. And there is 2 tabs to that, just so you're aware. There's an instructions tab that'll kind of walk you through what each of the fields means and how you're to go about using that. Okay. Okay, wonderful. So what I'm going to share with you next, or Aaron, would you like to talk about official versus electronic, or pardon me, official? They're all potentially official, whether they're electronic or in paper. The question is, are they official or are they transitory?
Yeah. So I figure everyone who's even started to think about information management, you do know what kind of an official and a transitory document is. You might not have the vocabulary attached to it, but basically a transitory document is something you don't need. It's not going to record a big decision being made. It's not going to authorize a change. It's things like, an instant message from a colleague asking, do you want to go for lunch? It's a meeting invite. It's an email with a link to a document, that sort of thing. They're transitory, and those are the ones that they figure you can get rid of pretty much as soon as you're not using them anymore. And then you have official documents, or as we call them at my work, information resources of business value, which is a bit of a mouthful, and those are the ones that you do want to keep. They generally, a quick way to rule of thumb identify them is, do they make a decision or do they record a decision being made? So things like meeting minutes, for us, it's, documents we've sent off to EPOD, our responses to assessments, our responses to access to information requests. So the things that you want to be able to pull up later to say, this is what we did, this is why we did it, and this is how we came to that decision. And so those are the ones that you then have to apply a more formal retention period to. Oh, Wendy, do you have a hand, or you just?
This is, sorry, I just wanted to repeat what you said. This is what we did, why we did it, and the
how we did it.
How we did it. So the how is the, so if you got directive from chief and council or etc., is that correct?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, I just gonna write that down.
Yeah, no, it's, yeah. And, you know, it varies work or department to department too. So for example, one of my colleagues who is really lovely and has been handling a lot of our communications with finance, she has a record of just about every contract we've entered into for the past almost 10 years, which is really useful, but it's not actually, technically, it's not information we need to keep because we have a whole finance department that keeps track of these things. But it's useful for her to keep these records so that way she can tell, you know, if we need to go get some boxes sent off for shredding, that sort of thing, she knows who to reach out to. And so that's kind of that third gray area of document, which is a reference document. And those are things that, you know, they don't necessarily show a decision being made, but they're really useful to keep on hand. And
if I may, Erin, if I can help just solidify this a little bit, because I think where you're going with this is you're really looking at what is the value of the information.
Exactly,
right?
yes.
So when we look at records, we're not just looking at what do they contain, what do they say, in other words, right? But it's also their context.
Yeah.
What's happening around them? Why were they created? What else are they connected to? What else is going on?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
That
because the way that we create and we keep records together, it forms a story, right? So in other words, when you pick up a file folder, you're going to see a lot of information there that's helping you connect the dots, right? You may need an electronic folder to help create the full picture, but ultimately there's a relationship amongst those records. And why is there a relationship there? Well, this is where it's coming back to the purpose of the record, right? Is it for legal purposes, evidentiary purposes, financial, legal, or plain old informational?
Yeah, exactly.
Kinds of lenses that we'll look through from a RIM perspective to say, well, what is the value here? What is the importance of this record? And so just utilizing a little bit of that language in terms of the values is all I wanted to do, Erin, was to share that.
No, thank you. Yeah, and so my thoughts about when you're starting a RIM project is you want to have those things sorted out first. Like, what records are you aiming to capture and aiming to retain for long periods, because you'll need them. And the way to do that, so far as I can tell, and I know Wendy was at the smaller breakout, so she knows this already, but it's talk to everyone. So you want to talk to the people who use the records on a day-to-day basis, the people who are going to be creating items, the people who will be accessing them this year, the people who will access them, you know, next year. And so that way, when you're starting to build whatever structure you're storing the materials in, it's going to be a system that is usable for the highest number of people possible. So just to use kind of an example from work, we're very slowly, very slowly starting to move onto a new kind of system for managing our electronic records. And they've developed a file structure for us to use that is very top-down centric. So they talked a lot to our directors and our ministers. So the system is really well designed for things that directors and ministers need to worry about day-to-day records for. So it's going to be really great for responding to access to information requests. It's going to be really great for dealing with, you know, an audit or a litigation hold. It runs into a bit of trouble with the scientists who need to access those materials in a very different way. So we're currently doing some restructuring there, and I'm excited to see what the final version will look like, but talk to everyone constantly about the system you're building. And they may be sick of it, but it means they'll know it's coming. So they'll be a little more primed to accept the change. And if they feel like they're being heard and brought in on the discussion, they will be, again, a lot more willing to buy into the change.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just talk to everyone all the time, please. A big chunk of my job is going from kind of the larger CWS or the larger Environment and Climate Change Canada information management in spectrum or discussions, and then coming back to the Pacific and going, okay, so this is what the plan is. Let's, like, is it going to work? Please don't freak out about it. Here's how it will work. Like, so I may just be overweighting the communication aspects, but if nothing else, it means they'll buy into it a bit more, and that's so helpful.
Absolutely. And you're going to hear a dedicated session on change management as we close out day 2.
I'm really excited about that.
I am too. So yes, I don't think you're overstating it. I think it's an absolute necessity. I think ultimately, I think people are hesitant of change. I think it's a natural hesitation, right? Because you're losing something. You're perhaps in a position where you've been the go-to person for so long, and now I'm not needed. I'm not needed as that person, right? Everyone can serve themselves. There can be significant feelings around that and pushback. So being aware of it, being mindful of it, talking to people, asking questions, right?
Yeah.
Like Erin says, the more you speak to people, the more ownership they're going to feel because they're being heard.
Yeah. Right.
So it's really, really important. And in my opinion, at the end of the day, really all people want to know is, what do you want me to do? Just tell me and show me what it is you want me to do, and I'll do it.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
But if it's left very abstract, it's near impossible to gain traction on that.
It's hard to plan for.
Right. It really is. So that's why, we need to have different tools that we can utilize. We need to have things like policy. And as we're talking about this, if it's okay, I'd like to share a roadmap in terms of RIM program development. Would that be helpful at this stage, do you think? Okay. All right. So bear with me while I pull this one up. I think I might have to do this first. Okay.
If I could just speak to the change.
Sure, please do.
Change management. What I tell people is, without change, we don't grow. And without progress, we would still be using a printer press and a chisel. And I try to explain it in those terms, and that it shouldn't be something that we are afraid of, but something that we can utilize, and you can utilize it at your speed. But also I tell people that I forget her name, but she was one of our guest speakers when I was in school. And she said, do not become the way of the dinosaur because they're extinct. So in my business classes, she said what she was saying was, if you don't keep up with technology, you become the dinosaur. No one has a need for you. We build these skills so that we are always in a job, that we always can do what is necessary. So that's how I try to always go about like the changes. And I know people are, just like what you all said before about people are leery of change. But I've also told my boss, when I become one of those people who fights the change, who fights everything, I was like, you need to fire me. I was like, I'll put that in my contract. So he's like, okay, put it in your contract. I'll sign it. but it's about growth and change, and always being, and I'm not saying forget everything. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying, be ready always to grow some more. Like, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing, we'd still be crawling, or we'd, without change. So I just I try to explain it in ways that people don't feel so threatened by it, because it is hard to deal with, right? And as we get older, it gets harder and harder to deal with it, I find. Anyway, sorry, thank you.
No, that's it exactly. I know one of the things I do when I'm talking to folks who are a little leery of the change is I really try and highlight what it's going to do for them. Like, I promise this will make your life easier, because the thing is, like, when you're doing a records or information management project, you can see where kind of the shortcomings of the current situation are, but folks who are doing other things, they have, the system works for them. maybe it doesn't work as well as they might like, or it's a little clunky at times, but they're able to do everything they need most of the time. And so if you can highlight, it's going to make it so much easier to find, that thing you worked on 3 years ago, or it's going to make working on a collaborative document way smoother for you. Like those sort of focusing on what the actionable and positive changes in their life are going to be is always good.
Absolutely. Excellent. No, thank you for that, Wendy. That's really great. That's helpful. And I think we can all relate very much so. So what I'm showing you here, can you see the screen? Is it showing you the roadmap? Okay, because I had a second monitor. I wanted to make sure that it followed me over. Okay. So this is a roadmap that we utilize within the RIM MTA with the FMPSS. And what this is showing us is that records management. Pardon me?
Handouts. Oh, I think we're just seeing your handouts folder. We're not seeing that particular.
Are you
RIM
serious?
Right now.
Oh, pardon me. Okay. Let me try this again. How about now?
There it is. Yes.
Yay. Okay, good. Sorry, that wasn't a trick question. Okay. So now we're all seeing a roadmap, right? And what we're seeing here is the key foundational pieces of any healthy records program. So what we're talking about, so legs and regs, that's just short term for legislation and regulations. Okay. So as we were hearing earlier today, we have to understand, we still even, sorry, let me back up. In the First Nations context, we still have to look at federal legislation, provincial legislation, sometimes even local government legislation, okay? We also have the ability to create our own laws in First Nations, okay? But again, those laws can't trump those other laws that exist at the federal and provincial level. So we have to understand, what does this look like for our particular organization? What legislation applies to us? That includes your own laws, resolutions, and policies as well. So if your organization has records management laws, bylaws, resolutions, etc., I really hope you're following them, because that effectively is your legislation and regulation that you are developing and being accountable for, right? So that's really where a lot of RIM program development begins. So of course, have your conversations, talk to everybody, find out what's going on, okay? And there's another link that I'll share with you in a moment for the RIM assessment tool that the FMPSS has developed. So you can take that tool. It's got 37 interview questions built right in and some scoring mechanisms. So you can really take it and run with it. Okay, and so it's to help you identify, where are you in your records management journey? Okay, so one of the first things we look at with RIM development is that legislation, regulation, laws, the resolutions, and the kinds of standards and principles that we are adhering to. So if you are in a First Nations community and you have protocols around knowledge sharing, traditional knowledge sharing, then it's important that those protocols be infused in this entire process. Okay. So it needs to reflect your organization's or your community's needs. Next to that, we have corporate policies and procedures. So I did mention the RIM procedure. You might have, or policies, sorry, you may have others that you want. You may want email retention policies. You might want traditional knowledge policies. There could be a whole wealth of additional policies that you may enact as part of your overarching RIM program development. For all your policies, it's really important that you have procedures to support them, because the procedures is really the how, right? How do we do this work? Whereas the policy is the why. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? So then we have to make sure that we're giving our staff that ability to have resources that they need to fulfill their responsibilities with RIM. Because as we know, it's a shared responsibility, right? Although if you have a RIM coordinator or a dedicated RIM position, they're really your go-to person, and they're the one that's going to do the heavy lifting in terms of developing the policies, devising the training, right? Doing that kind of work, right, Erin?
Yeah.
Whereas for, most staff, it's really just being available to do the training, to take the time out of your busy schedules. And I know it's much easier said than done, to be able to purge out your emails, for example. Get rid of all the transitory documents that we have in there, right?
Yep.
So there's a number of different tasks that we're performing all the time that's records related. Do we keep it? Don't we? If we keep it, where do we put it? Once we put it there, what happens to it? Do I have to rename it? Do I have to worry about how many years go by, or does someone else take care of that part, right? There's a lot of different considerations here. This piece here, the RCRS, that one is, that stands for Records Classification and Retention Schedule. Okay, it's kind of a mouthful, but it's a cornerstone document to any healthy records program. If you do not have one in your organization or your department, you're going to want to create one or adopt one. Okay, there's many models out there. There's provincial models, there's federal models, and as I mentioned earlier, there is a model for First Nations that I shared in the chat already. So you don't have to start from scratch. Okay, but absolutely essential, because all of the records that are being created in your organizations, whether it sits in a database or your own servers or in your paper files, you have to be able to run retention on those records. Okay, so again, coming back to where we started, we need to know what we have, where we have it, so that we can then determine how long we have to keep it. Right?
Exactly.
So that's the foundation. Sorry, Wendy, you have a question?
Is that sort of, so your records classification and retention schedule, so is that like for finance, they have to keep things for 7 years and then they
Correct.
get rid of it? Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
That's right, that's right.
Because
So
I'm
it's
not
going
a
to be
finance
very,
person, but I kind of know that, so
Yeah.
just checking.
that's right, exactly. So you may have heard that there's a 7-year rule for retaining records, right? I should have mentioned in the beginning that rule is a fallacy.
Yeah, it's
Okay. Yes.
since
So Wendy,
been
you are correct
superseded.
that many financial records have a retention of 7 years,
Mhm.
but there are financial records that are permanent.
Yes.
And if you are in a First Nations that is under the Societies Act, like some tribal councils are, then guess what? Your retention is 10 years, not 7, because that's the legislation that speaks to the Societies Act. Okay, so understanding the kind of organization that you're in is critical in order to understand how long your records are to be retained. Okay, so when you're looking at legislation that's out there, such as the Income Tax Act, which is where I think we get that 7-year rule for retention, right? Because we're instructed, right? We are conditioned to keep our taxation records for 7 years, right? But it doesn't mean that that applies to everything. So what we have to do is really look at, well, what is the purpose of those records? If there's legislation that's silent, which most of the time it is, in terms of the retention, then we have to look at our business needs. How long do we need these records for, right? So that becomes more of a complex conversation with departments, such as lands and resources, language and culture, those kinds of areas. It can become very different. Like, why I'm saying different is in the federal government sense, when we talk about the archives of Canada, okay? And Erin, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here. From my recollection, approximately 3 to 4% of all records created by the federal government ever make it to an archives.
Yes, and I think that number is right. And there's also the period of wait time that takes into account the significant backlog that Library and Archives Canada is unfortunately always working through. So
Right.
while you have stuff, for in our context at least, that we have flagged as at one at some point it's going to go to Library and Archives Canada. We also have stuff like, for example, pretty much all of our data holdings where we've decided that we're treating these records as evergreen. They're always going to be valuable to us, and we're always going to keep them in a manner that we control. So that means we have a data shared drive. It means we have a floor in a barn that's full of paper. But and that's because, for us at least, this data record will always be useful because, you know, sure, maybe it's a record of what the weather was like in the summer of 1972 for someone who is doing a bird count in Haida Gwaii. But then say someone comes along in 3 years and wants to do a longer term study of what weather is like, that's going to be fantastic, or it can be used for population comparisons. So you're going to find records that might not be flagged in any of your policies or any legislation that are still going to be incredibly valuable for you and your organization. So yeah, it's all records retention schemes and plans are so really individualized to the group they're serving. And that's one of the things that makes them really neat, because I'm sure that most of the stuff we have, the finance department at Canadian Wildlife Service does not care about because it's not their mandate. But we have people who will threaten to chain themselves to their tower servers if they try and take it. So yeah, what will matter will vary so much on context. So you don't have to be stuck in any particular pre-made system, or, you know, you have a lot of flexibility according to what you need.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So just to add to that, my experience working with First Nations and their archives. So with records programs and archives, that number, instead of being 3 to 4% of all records, it's probably more like 20 to 25%, right? Like, it is a considerable amount of information that is very detailed and community specific and valuable to the community in ways that we want to make sure we have this forever, right? So whether they're, you know, what used to be called traditional use studies, right? Those kinds of interviews, and then the plotting on the maps and things like that, those will never be destroyed by First Nations organizations, right? Not a chance. Same thing with recorded stories, right? So there's an incredible amount of information within First Nations that have very different requirements by way of retention and use than do other levels of government.
Looks like we got a question from Ramona on
okay.
Evergreen Records. So it varies is an answer that comes up a lot, but it depends on what those Evergreen Records are going to be used for. So if they're Evergreen Records that you know you're going to be using, say, once every year, once every 5 years, once every 10 years. So, you know, if it looks like, okay, I'm only going to need these probably once every 10 years, it's probably a good bet that they could go to an archive. So that way, you know, they're managed, you know, they're safe, you know, they're retrievable, and you don't have to manage that retrieving as much. For the stuff that might be usable every year, maybe you want to put that in a specific place where it's not getting, you know, in a shared drive that's not accessed every day, but is still on hand for when you need it. In our case, with the data, we keep it in region just because of the power concerns in terms of access. So if you have to access a huge file from a server in Ottawa, it takes longer than if you have to access a huge file from a server in Delta. And so, you know, it's depends on how often you're going to use it, how much work it's going to be to get it back from, say, an archive versus a shared drive versus an offsite storage location. Yeah, you get to make those calls on how you're storing things and what's going to work best for you and your organization.
Absolutely, you do. So it's definitely not cookie cutter, right?
No.
The extent of our cookie cutter kind of rests with this roadmap.
Yeah.
In terms of, here's those key elements that you need to be aware of and be preparing for. Okay. So we've touched on those foundational pieces. Okay, we've provided you with a little bit of reference material in terms of where you can go for some additional info. And I do believe Erin has some more resource information to share as well.
Yeah.
But before I close this down and we move on, in terms of implementing, so we've touched on change management. So we know we have to involve everyone, right? We have to have the conversation. There also has to be careful planning that's gone into implementation. So when you're thinking about, okay, so if we want to adopt this model for classification, say, and there's a model resolution there, perfect. Let's get chief and council to pass it. Off we go. Where do we start? Where do we start? You probably want to start small. I would say choose a department or choose a work area that is keen and agreeable. Okay, start there. Build your success, learn from those mistakes perhaps that happen along the way, take that knowledge forward, and then move your way into the more difficult areas. Okay, so in a lot of my experience, RIM implementation begins in administration. Oftentimes it'll be the lands department. They're the ones that are so keen because they see the value in this all day long. Right, in terms of being able to access the information. So choose whomever is going to be most keen and benefit the most from implementation, because success breeds success. If you start and fall on your face, that is going to have more complications in terms of gaining trust with the remaining staff as to how we need to go forward, right? So we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to falter and fall, but it's a matter of how well we plan and prepare for that. Okay. So when you're planning implementation, look at it as department by department approach. Don't take it on as I have to do my entire organization all at one time. Okay. So work your way into those more complicated areas. Make sure you have a procedural manual that's going to help your staff with anything they need to know if they can't talk to you that day or at that moment. Okay, so having some method of tracking your files, which I provided you just an example of an Excel spreadsheet to utilize, that's something that you can give to people and say, here's to help you out. So even before we start assigning numbers to these things, let's just find out what we have and where is it. Okay, and then assign those tasks so that you can have multiple people creating these kinds of spreadsheets that you can, of course, pull together into a database or, you know, work that data however you want to down the road. So the classification projects, that's just indicating we're always going to have backlog. We're always going to have those records that we just don't know where they fit in this new scheme. So approach it carefully. What are those most important records? Start there. Okay. And always, always, always train staff. And you definitely do not train them 2 years before they're going to use a system.
Yeah.
That's terrible.
Yeah, I've taken that GC Docs training. It's actually really nice training.
Just poorly timed.
Yeah, but we're not going to be onboarded onto GC Docs anymore. And so now I'm waiting with bated breath for the new training that we'll get at some point.
Exactly. And with training, I just want to point out here that new employee orientation is an ideal location to have some RIM content, even just to say, we have a method for utilizing a shared drive, for example, okay? Or we're using OneDrive, or we're using Teams or SharePoint, or whatever it is you're doing. If you can advise your new hires that there is a method to this, and we can provide you with a procedures manual for your reference before we're able to sit down with you and provide you training, that's incredibly helpful, okay? With training, it's not a one and done situation, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, right? This is something that's ongoing. We're here learning together today and tomorrow. This is just one opportunity that we have, which is very fabulous that we can do these things, right? Because I think in a lot of ways we feel alone in this kind of work, right? When truly we are not. So I hope you're getting that sense. So I'm just going to stop sharing that now. I'll share that within the chat here. There's a couple other things too. I'm just going to share them in the chat so you can refer to them if you'd like, but there's a checklist in here that I've just shared. that is basically what are the key components you need for a records program. So it's similar to the content we've just shared with you, just packaged a little bit differently. Okay, so I'm hoping you'll find that helpful. And I'll also share with you here a link, a document that contains numerous resources. Okay, so again, it's a resource handout that we use with the MTA, and I just thought I'd share that. I know, Erin, you have something as well, so I'll turn it over to you.
Just as Michelle has all these wonderful resources, I have a much smaller one, really, and it's just got some quick definitions on record types, life cycle, and then mainly its links, the legal acts I've been able to find for information management in BC and in Canada, a couple links to various record keeping organizations in, again, the BC area, so ARMA and the Archives Association of BC, and then some links relating to just general resources for records management. So I will toss that in the chat as well.
Perfect.
As soon as I can see it on my screen as well as I can see the chat.
Sure.
Yeah, so
yeah.
There we go.
So you just saw that I placed the link for the RIM assessment toolkit for anyone that's interested.
Yeah. It's also linked on the handout.
It is linked up. You're going to have links to this all day long. So it's all great. Thank you, Amory.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Perfect. Oh, and there is one more that we can share. I know we're at time pretty much, but this is a document here that we're hoping you will find helpful in your travels. So this is an official versus a transitory records decision flowchart. So I've had some fantastic feedback from this flowchart. I've heard people say that they pinned it up at their desk, and so they refer to it all the time. And really, it's there as a helpful tool. Okay, so if you're sitting there wondering, do I need to keep this and treat it as an official record, which means it's got to follow your record life cycle and your whole program, or is it something we can just get rid of because it's a non-record, in other words, right? That's another way to look at transitory. So that's there for your convenience if you would like. Erin?
Yeah, and just to really highlight that particular resource, I find a lot of kind of the day-to-day questions I get about records management are, does this count as a record that I need to keep? Does it have business value? Can I delete this? So, you know, I've got a couple of flowcharts like that, and I'm always happy to get a new one because it is kind of a constant question. And, you know, if you have those sort of resources on hand, then at least it'll be about a new type of record every time you get the question. So that means everyone's learning.
Absolutely.